I'm very honoured to be invited to speak here. I don't think I have ever been all of the morning of a conference before, and I hope you don't get too bored with me. I have a PhD in boredom. That was what my PhD was, the psychology of boredom. So I warn you. Anyway, I'm very honoured and very delighted to be here. I guess, just to elaborate a bit, I suppose my understanding of work and mental health and addiction problems comes from a number of different views. For 30 years, I worked in the National Health Service in Britain, in secondary specialist mental health services, but also setting up psychology services in primary care. I've spent 15 years employing people with a mental health condition, and I will tell you about that. I also have a long-term mental health condition myself. So that means you can all ignore what I say if you want. It's just my madness. But I also have spent 12 years setting up individual placement with support programs. In 2009, I was asked by our Minister for Work and Pensions to do a national review for government about how we can support people with mental health problems in employment nationally. And as I say, now I sort of sit in the Department of Work and Pensions and do work for the Department of Health. So my ambition is for employment services and health services to speak to each other, which is why I am delighted to be here where we have people from both sides, as it were. Now, I suppose one of the things that I learned very early in my career was just how important work is for people. I think when we have work, we sometimes forget what it's like not to have work. I know that very early in 192 AD, the Greek philosopher and physician Galen said that work is nature's best physician and essential for human happiness. We then have poets talking about the absence of occupation is not rest. A mind quite vacant is a mind distressed. And the one thing we can say about work is it unites psychiatrists who usually disagree with each other. So we have Freud talking about how human beings need two things, love and work binds us to reality. We have Thomas Szasz, who was the enemy of Freud, talking about work being the closest thing to a panacea we have in medical science. And then we have a more mainstream psychiatrist, Bob Drake, saying that the best thing you can do for someone with schizophrenia is get them a job. One day someone will do a controlled trial of drugs versus jobs. I don't know. And then, of course, we have the novelist, American novelist, saying that work is just about the only thing you can do for 8 hours a day. The first paper I ever wrote about work was in 1988, and it was called "You Can't Eat, Drink or Make Love for 8 hours a Day, The Value of Work in Mental Health." I think it was the title that means it's still quoted today. But I guess we know from so many people just how good work is for you. And if I may quote from someone who I interviewed as part of a piece of work I did for the government. For some of us, an episode of mental distress will disrupt our lives, so we're pushed out of society. For others, the early onset of distress will mean social exclusion throughout our adult lives, with no prospect of training or hope for a future of meaningful employment. Loneliness and loss of self-worth lead us to believe that we are useless. So we live with this sense of hopelessness, or far too often choose to end our lives. And we do know that unemployment is associated with suicide. I have been doing quite a lot of work in the Republic of Ireland at the moment, and there are many people in the Republic of Ireland now who are unemployed, and their suicide rates have gone up. And I think we've got to be real. Work is very good for our health. If you are unemployed, you are more likely to get all sorts of diseases. You're more likely to die younger. And you in particular are more likely to get mental health problems. And if you already have mental health problems and you are unemployed, then you are more likely to relapse. But it's not just about our health. Work links us to our communities and allows us to contribute to our communities. One of the things that happens if you develop mental health problems or addiction problems is that you end up with everybody helping you. You are on the receiving end of help. One of the most important things that you can have is the chance to give back to our communities. There are many ways of giving back, but in all of our societies, work has a special place. It's the way we contribute to our communities and we get paid for our contribution. I have seen more tears cried over the first paycheck that people get. Just last month, a woman phoned me up and she was crying and she said, "I never thought anyone would pay me for anything ever again." There is just something about that worth that it gives you. But of course, it also gives you a reason to get up in the morning. I love you all dearly, but if I hadn't had to come here, I would still be in my bed. And I think maybe so would you. But it also gives us a status, an identity, doesn't it? I have met many people in the last few days. The first question you ask is, what is your name? The second question you ask is, what do you do? And doing bipolar disorder is a real conversation stopper. People don't know how to proceed. I suppose, though, it also gives us our social contacts. We know that if you're unemployed, you don't use your spare time to go and meet people. You become more and more isolated. And most of us meet our friends, our partners, in the course of either our work or our studying. It is very much how we get our social networks. And of course, it also gives us the money that we need to do all the other things in life that we love. When I was first diagnosed, I thought, that is it. My life is over. I will lose my home, my friends, and my sports car. And I am very fond of my sports car. One psychiatrist did ask me, Rachel, how many sports cars have you bought? It was only one, honestly. But I guess the importance of work is also being recognised internationally. Article 23 of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights talks about the right to work and the right to free choice of employment. And this is repeated in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People and indeed in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So very much it's internationally enshrined in rights. But for many people with mental health conditions, it's a right that we are denied. We know that many, many people with a mental health problem, most people with a mental health problem, want to work. But I don't know what the numbers are in Norway, but in England, overall, our employment rate is now about 74%. The employment rate for disabled people generally is around 50%. If we look at people with mental health problems, we are talking about an employment rate of 21%. If we look at people who are using specialist mental health services, it gets down to about 13%. So we are talking about 87% unemployment, which I think is a crime. It's a crime in that it spoils people's lives, but it's also a crime in the waste of talent that we have. There is a great deal of talent amongst people with mental health conditions, and too often people don't have a chance to use that talent. So that's why. But the question I always get asked by employers, by people in employment services, by people in mental health services, can they work? And we have spent a great deal of money internationally trying to answer the question, what makes someone employable? Are people work ready? I believe that's the wrong question to ask, because all of this research has failed to show any relationship between diagnosis, severity of your problems, how long you've had your problems, and whether you can work. It doesn't sound sensible. People believe that if you're very severely ill, you cannot work. But actually, the evidence is not good on that one. There do appear to be two things that determine whether you can work. To use the psychology jargon, motivation and self-efficacy. In ordinary language, that means if you want to work and if you believe you can, you are very likely to be able to. The trouble is that what happens if you have mental health problems is that very often everyone tells you you can't work. When I was first diagnosed, my psychiatrist, well, she was very nice. She was very kind. When I said, can I go back to work now? She said, don't go back. Don't think about it until you feel really ready. How many of you have been off work for a time? Maybe having children? What? Yeah? Some of you? The longer you are off, do you feel more ready to go back? No. The longer you are off, the more scared you are of going back. I won't be able to cope. She was being kind, my psychiatrist. Then she said, Rachel, are you sure you can be a clinical psychologist? Don't you think you ought to find a less stressful job? Maybe part-time administrative work. I was devastated. Fortunately, I was non-compliant and she was wrong. But there are many, many people who believe what the experts say. They are not being nasty, they are not being unkind. They're trying to be caring, but the impact is that it makes you feel useless. As part of the review that I did, I got together groups of young people who were looking for work with mental health problems and asked them about their experiences. And all of them said either nobody ever mentioned work, or they told me not to because it would be too stressful. I sometimes think we forget about the stress of unemployment, but never mind. And one of the really shocking things was I spoke to one young woman, she was 21, and she had just got a degree from Oxford University. In England, that's seriously good. People like me didn't go to Oxford. She had just got her degree, and she told me in tears that her psychiatrist had told her she shouldn't try and get a job because it was bad for her. And I thought that was so bad, so wicked to say to a young woman of that age. So it looks as if actually, if everybody tells you you can't do something, you actually believe them. Not everyone's as difficult as me. People do believe what experts say and give up. And I suppose one of the most tragic things I have seen over 30 years of working in mental health services is how many people have given up on themselves, given up on their possibilities. What the research does tell us, though, is that the most important thing that tells you whether someone can work is what sort of help we give them. The majority of the variance in outcome is determined by type of support. What that means is actually the thing we've got to look at is what sort of help we give people. I don't know whether it's the same here, but in England, we firmly believed in sheltered workshops. We set up nice, safe places just for people with mental health problems where people could regain, we thought these would be a stepping stone to work, that people would get their self-respect, learn skills, and then be able to go into work. The reality was they didn't. When I looked at one of the works, the man knows. He can. They are so sensitive in Norway. No one notices in England. The last workshop that I ran, and I did run sheltered workshops in the olden days, I looked at whether people had got work. And actually, you were more likely to escape by death than you were to get a job. In the last year, 3 people died of natural causes. 1 person got a half-time job. And if we look at the research evidence, those stepping stones don't work. Actually, we convince people that the only place they can work is in a special, safe place. And I think it's a bit like learning to swim. You don't stand on stepping stones if you're trying to swim, because you never get into the water. People don't need stepping stones, they need water wings. Help to stay afloat in work, not help to stay out of the water. And I do think that's a lesson that I have learned very hard, because I can think of many times when I have organised special separate work in the 1980s and people didn't get jobs at the end of it. But we do know from lots of randomised control trials, proper research, that if we provide the right kind of support, around 60% of people with serious mental health problems can get work. These are people with diagnoses of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, borderline personality disorder, many of whom have dual diagnosis, addiction problems and mental health problems. Bob Drake, who was the man who did a lot of work on this, is also a specialist in dual diagnosis. And again, it's a variety of people. And these are the employment rates, around 60%, and all over the world as well, even in Hong Kong. I didn't know there was a trial in Hong Kong, and it worked very well. The long-term outcomes are also good. Deborah Becker looked at people follow-up between 8 and 12 years and found that everyone had worked at some point, and 71% of those people were regular workers. So even over long periods of time, it appears to work. The one with the circle round it is the one that I was involved in. This was Europe. It was a European randomised control trial, and there were 6 European centres involved. There was me in London, in the London borough of Richmond. There was Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Bulgaria. And this one was a bit different. This one only involved people with a diagnosis of psychosis, and only people who had been ill for at least 2 years. So it was people with longer-term psychosis. And what they did was they compared IPS with a train and place approach, so pre-vocational training and experience. And as everywhere else in the world, they found that IPS was significantly better than a train and place approach. 55% of people got jobs. What is more, actually, the dropout rates were less. If we look at the people who started the training for work, 45% of them lost the will to live and dropped out. They gave up thinking that they would get jobs. So the dropout rate from IPS was 13%. The dropout rate for a training programme was 45%. And also, and this matters in England, we are very short of money in England at the moment, they were less likely to get admitted. In English services, the admission rates are what persuades people it is a good idea. You are not, I believe, in the same financial difficulties as we are in. But far fewer people who'd received IPS were readmitted to hospital. But what is this right kind of support? People sometimes talk to me about an IPS model. I'm not sure that it is a model as such. I see IPS as 7 principles. 7 principles that we must adopt in our services if we want to give people the best chance of getting work. The first thing is, if you want to help people to work, aim for real jobs. Not training and education and things on the way, real jobs. And believe that it is possible. When I select employment specialists, the biggest qualification is, do they believe people can work? That can-do attitude, very American, a bit alien in England, but people have to believe it. I guess the second thing is, do it quickly. Help people to start getting jobs as quickly as possible. And don't just work with the individual. Go find the jobs. Look at employers, talk to employers, find where jobs are. We have to be working on both sides. The third one, and really important, is you have to make sure that employment is part of our regular clinical work. In England, it used to be that you treat people, you get them better, and then you think about rehabilitation. No. That's not the way to do it. We've got to start talking to people and thinking about work right at the start. It's got to be built into our clinical treatment and support plans, not just in secondary specialist services, but in primary care as well. Does your doctor, does your general practitioner ask you about work when you go in with a mental health problem? Do they help you to think about how to get back? Do they help you to think about maybe doing a bit less, working part-time? Do they actually help you to think about how work fits in with the treatment? And I guess that means having employment specialists as part of our multidisciplinary teams. So we have a psychiatrist, we have a psychologist, we have a nurse, and we have an employment specialist. All of them are there. I think the next thing is eligibility based on client choice. What this means is, if someone says, I think I might just maybe want to get a job, you help them. You don't assess whether they're ready. You don't assess whether they're employable. You say, okay, we'll give it a go. And it doesn't have to be someone who's absolutely convinced. Most people are a bit cautious at the start. I don't know whether I can do it, but I'd really like to. That's what we have to build on, that if you think you can do it. The next one is rocket science. It is seriously clever, this. People are more likely to get and keep jobs that they want to do rather than jobs that clinicians think are good for them. That really is unusual, isn't it? It can lead you to difficult situations. In the early intervention psychosis team that I set up, there was a young woman. She had been a pole dancer. You know what that is? Yeah. And she wanted to go back to pole dancing. Well, the team had to think long and hard. We asked her if she'd like to be a beauty therapist. No. She could earn good money as a pole dancer, and that's what she wanted to do. eventually we helped her to do that. She's very successful, she pays her taxes, it's not illegal. Unfortunately, the British press got hold of this. I was the headlines. NHS helps woman to become pole dancer. Dr. Rachel Perkins. It was quite amusing because if you looked at the responses to those, they all said, so what? And it united the whole of the mental health world and well, if that's what she wants to do, go for it. So, but I say there can be those interesting dilemmas with that one, but it is important. If someone wants to do it, give them a try, providing it's legal. We do have limits at legality. One young man did say he wanted to be a drug dealer. We did actually not do that, but we helped him to think about why he might want to be a drug dealer and what else there might be to achieve those things. That was where we didn't help. I think the next thing we've got to remember is that for many people, mental health problems fluctuate. Sometimes you're fine, like now. Sometimes you're in a bad way. That means we've got to make sure that support is ongoing and that it fluctuates. So sometimes people will need very little. Other times they need a lot of help. And we've got to make sure that support's there. But it's not just the person. Employment is about a relationship between an individual and their manager, their employer. And we have got to support both sides of that relationship. It's more like family therapy. That what we're trying to do, we've got to support both parties there, support employers to think about how they can make adjustments, support for that person when they're having a bad time, help the individual how to make a go of it. And the final thing, if it's anything like England here, you have to give people advice about welfare benefits. In England, there are 32 benefits for working age people. It's a minefield. We have a specialism in mental health services called welfare rights. And we employ people to actually work out the complexities of the benefits system. Some of them you can get in work, some of them you can get out of work. I'm sure it's much more sensible in Norway. In England, we're trying to sort it out, but it's taking time. But I think one of the really important bits of this research is that you can't pick and choose between these 7. You've got to do them all. There may be other things you do within them, but you have to do all 7. The more you adhere to those 7 principles, the better the outcomes. And I've met in England a lot of people who say, well, we do number 2, or we do most of them, but not that bit. And if you look at the outcomes, they are less good. But it's not just in all this research stuff. I don't know about you, but I read research and then I look at my day-to-day clinical work and I think they're not the same. So one of the things that I did personally was in England was say, okay, how can we make this really work in England? Not in America, not in Hong Kong, but how can we make this work in regular practice in England? I worked for 23 years in southwest London. That's the big NHS specialist service that covers a population of 1 million people in southwest London. We had a staff of about 2,600 and at any one time were serving about 15,000 people from that area. We had the usual array of general adult services, community mental health teams, inpatient units, assertive outreach, early intervention, all of those kinds of teams. We also ran all the addictions services for the local area, and we had the usual detox wards, community teams, addiction centres in the community. We also ran all the psychological therapy services in primary care. So we employed the people who worked in primary care. And then, of course, we had services for older people and services for young people and children, services for people who'd committed offences, forensic services. We had specialist services for people who were deaf. We did a lot of work with learning disabilities. So it was a very big organisation. And so what I said in 1998 was, we're going to do IPS. What's that? Don't be stupid, Rachel. Are you taking your tablets? So what we did was we piloted it in one team. I said, okay, give me one post and I will put it in a team. And they were all very suspicious. And so they wheeled out their most difficult client and said, we'll get him a job then. And you know, we did. And that was when they started changing their minds. Because I think we all think we do evidence-based practice, but the real evidence, we believe, is the evidence of our own eyes. And when you can see someone that you know who's made it, you start changing your mind. I know it sounds daft, and yes, I read all the papers, but I didn't believe all this could work until I went to the United States in 1993 and saw people who I would never have dreamed could work, working in ordinary jobs, getting paid for them. So I suppose we started that out, and we recruited employment specialists to work in our community teams, in our addictions teams, in our first episode psychosis teams. Their job was really to make sure that work was part of everything that we did, was part of the assessment process, was part of the care planning, the treatment planning process. The employment specialists themselves helped people to think about what they wanted to do as work, help them to think about what was available in the area, to apply for jobs, think about their skills, write their CVs, and help them to actually prepare for interviews, go around knocking on doors, seeing if people had got jobs, helping them into work. But they also ensured that actually all the other mental health professionals thought about work and helped to ensure with the other professionals that people got the ongoing support they needed. So ongoing support wasn't always provided by the employment specialist. It may have been provided by the community psychiatric nurse or the occupational therapist with assistance from the employment specialist as they needed it. They also got to know employers locally, went round knocking on doors, knew what all the different local employers, who was recruiting, who wasn't, who was hopelessly anti-people with mental health problems. And so I looked at the supermarkets in my area. If you've got a mental health problem, I can tell you which one to go and apply for, because I know which ones have got managers who had an aunt with troubles, or a daughter who had a bit of a breakdown. They exist out there. You have to be able to find them. So knowing what's going on is really important. Okay, got 11 employment specialists working in 11 of our teams, including the community drug teams. In 2007-08, they served almost 2,000 people, and almost 1,200 of those either got a job or were engaged in education or voluntary work. That might sound odd. We try and help everyone to get a job first. That is the first thing we do. If after 9 months, a year or so, that isn't working out, then you may want to look at other things. But it's a work first approach with everyone. 645 people were helped to get and stay in open employment. And these are the graphs. This is the teams in one London borough, one London local authority. They had employment specialists. To start with, they had one employment specialist working across a lot of teams, and nothing much happened. They then got half an employment specialist in teams. They were shared. Started getting better. But it wasn't until we had a full-time employment specialist in every one of those teams that we really started seeing that increase in employment. At the same time, the local authority next door wasn't so far-sighted. They didn't employ people. and that is right next door what happened. This isn't a randomised control trial, it's just that one local authority employed people, the other one didn't. And that's what we got. I think, though, if someone was to ask me, I think yesterday someone asked me what I think the priority would be. I would say the priority is to get there early. I think we need to start thinking about employment as soon as someone develops a mental health problem. In England, we're rather good at not thinking about it, wait until they've lost their job and then help them to get it back. That's not the way to do it. Start at the start. And so I've been particularly interested in the impact of IPS in first episode teams. These are first episode psychosis teams. Internationally, you'll see it's been very effective, if anything more effective in these teams. In England, about half of people, when they're first admitted to hospital, have a job, or if they're young, are in education. A year later, that's typically 10%. So all of those are lost through neglect very often. In England, the team that I insisted had an employment specialist. They didn't want one to start off with. I gave them one for nothing and then told them if it worked, they'd have to pay for it after a year. They paid for it. What we found that after 2 years, 73% of those people were either in employment, about 48%, or had gone back to college, about another 23%. So what we were actually looking at there, these were young people, their average age was 21. So if we're talking about young people, sometimes we're talking about helping them to carry on with their education in the usual way. So we would say in early intervention teams, if someone breaks down at university, help them to get back to university, then help them to get a job at the end of it. There is one thing, though, here. I don't know whether it's the same in Norway, but in England, young people seem to change jobs a great deal. My nephews, I have 2 young nephews, and I think they change jobs rather like I change my socks. So it's not always about helping someone to stay in the same job. It's something about saying, okay, you're not so keen on that one, let's find something else. Or let's help you to get promoted. Let's help you to move forward in your job. It's not just about getting someone there and saying, right, fine, we've done it. And it's not just about stacking shelves. Quite often people say to me, oh, but they're all doing very basic entry-level jobs. This is a list of a series of 120 jobs that people got. As you can see, they're enormously varied. We've got accountants, nurses, bookmakers. I was a bit worried about the boatyard worker. I didn't think we had any boatyards in South London, but my employment specialists know better. There is a little one, they do jet skis. There isn't a lot of place to do jet skiing in London, but never mind. There's a lad who's working there. One woman became a hairdresser. I'll tell you about her. She was 31 when we met her. She'd always wanted to be a hairdresser, but when she'd first got ill, when she was in her early 20s, she'd given up. She'd thought, oh, well, there's no point. I can't do anything. Eventually, the team, with an employment specialist, started talking to her about her dream of being a hairdresser. And, you know, they helped her to do it. She got one of those apprenticeships, a modern apprenticeship, where you work in a hairdressing salon for 4 days and have day release in college. I don't know whether you have those sort of things, but that was what she got taken on to be. She did that, but she was a good businesswoman, this woman, and she thought, well, there's a lot of people on the estate who I work who are single mums, and they can't get out to get their hair done. So I could set up my own business doing cheap haircuts for single mums who can't get out. She's doing really well. Yep. Sometimes it's self-employment. She didn't want to work in the salon, and she's earning more now. She has little cards that she puts through people's doors, a regular clientele. If she's not having such a good day, having a bit of a difficult period, she doesn't do quite as many haircuts, but that's what she's doing. But it was actually a team effort. It wasn't just the employment specialist, it was everyone in that team who was working with her. So the employment specialist helped her to decide what she wanted to do, think about the different ways of doing it, liaised with the salon, the college and everything else. Her community psychiatric nurse helped her to think about, provide her with ongoing supports, talk about difficulties she was having at work. Her psychiatrist reviewed her medication. The medication she was on was a bit sedative and she was having real trouble getting up in the mornings. So we reviewed that, looked at the timing of it, changed that. And there was a role for psychologists like me. The psychologist did lots of work on how she was going to manage her symptoms at work. So it's not just one person, it's the effect that that one person has on the whole team. I think the other thing I've got to say is that we talked about whether people want to work being key. What we have found is that by providing support in teams, by the effect that has on a team, we increase people's belief that they can work. Not just the number of jobs, but whether people believe they can work. In England, we have a thing called the National Patient Survey every year. And one of the questions is, do you think you can work, or are you unable to work because of your mental health problems? Nationally, about half of the people say they can't work because of their mental health problems. In southwest London, where we have employment specialists in all of our teams, that's got down to a third. So 2/3 of people believe they can work. If we look at the first episode team, that's got down to 13%. So 87% believe they can work. So by providing the support, the effect that has is to make people think, yes, maybe I can do it. They see other people getting jobs, people who've been in that position. And that seems to be important. But I do have to say, it's not just employers out there. I don't know whether you know, but the NHS is the biggest employer in Europe since they disbanded the Red Army. We have got more jobs than any other employer. That means we actually have got access to an awful lot of employment opportunities. And way back in 1993, when I got back from America, I saw in America an awful lot of people with mental health problems working in mental health services. So I got back to England and I said, I think we can do that. Well, they really did ask if I was all right then. But I managed to persuade people. Because actually, we know that the expertise of people who've been there themselves, the expertise of lived experience, can be really important in recovery. It gives people an image of what's possible. It helps people to actually understand what it's like to live with mental health problems, how to actually do it. And as I say, it offers those images of possibility, not just to people with mental health problems, but also to staff. Staff normally don't see people when they're well and doing fine. They only see them when they're in a bad place. So we think that's everybody. We don't see people at those times. If you've got people working in your teams, you can actually see that most of the time people are fine. I think it also, I don't know whether you have, but we have these awful them and us barriers in our services. There's the providers and there's the users, and never the two shall meet. I wrote an article about toilets once. It was about, one of my big concerns is toilets. In our mental health services, we have separate toilets. There's toilets for the staff and there's toilets for the patients. And it always struck me, if you're not fit to use the same toilets, don't talk to me about dignity. And actually, someone like me has a bit of difficulty. 2 years ago, I was in hospital and I was relegated to the patients' toilets. But fortunately, a month later, I was promoted back to the staff toilets. I'm only saying that as an example of those kind of them and us barriers, a very real example that exist. And of course, my biggest motivation here was actually we had to lead by example. I couldn't go to Tesco's or Sainsbury's or British Telecom and say, will you employ someone, if I'm not actually employing people myself. So in a sense, we had to lead by example, put our own house in order. So, starting in 1995, I set up a programme. This was to help people to get jobs in our services. Same terms and conditions as everybody else, same pension rights, you know, proper jobs. We did 3 things. We set up a supported employment programme. We then had a charter for the employment of people with mental health problems. And then we set up a work experience programme. I'm just going to take you through those. The supported employment programme. Well, we employed in our organisation some employment specialists whose job it was to help people who thought they might want to work there, to help them find jobs, prepare for jobs, find things that were suitable, help them to get into work. You'll find in all my slides, I have something that's called support and encouragement. A lot of the job of an employment specialist is to say, I think you can, you know. I don't know, when any of you have got a new job, what happens? You're really excited to get it, and then you think, can I do it? No, maybe I'm better where I am. I'm never going to be able to cope. I think a lot of it is to help dispel those doubts. If you have a mental health condition and everyone's told you you're no good, then actually those doubts are even more. Helping people to think about what adjustments people might need at work. Actually, they were very small. Some people who had office jobs. Have any of you travelled on the London Underground in the rush hour? Have any of you had a panic attack on the London Underground in the rush hour? They are quite common. We did have some people who couldn't travel on the London Underground in the rush hour, so we adjusted ours. Start early, finish a bit early for some people. Other people found it difficult to switch between day shifts and night shifts on the wards. And so we gave them longer periods of day shifts and night shifts, difficult adjusting medication and such like. But we also help people with difficulties that arise at work, all sorts of practical help. And we also, after a while, started providing support to staff who developed mental health problems. We started out just helping people to get them. Then someone said, well, look, I've just been in hospital. Why can't I get some help too? So we had to extend it a bit. Right, we have supported people in 257 jobs in our organisation, given you some diagnoses there, not just in the mental health wards, but also in the addiction services. Our community addictions teams, I think all of them have got a support worker now who has had addiction problems themselves. In fact, the ward manager of our detox ward has herself in the past had addiction problems. Most people had been in hospital, most were working in clinical jobs, and actually the retention rate was very good. I don't know, do you have the same problem in your public sector of sickness rates? In England, they get very worried about public sector sickness rates. So various people said to me, won't they be off sick all the time? So we did some research. It was a bit worrying. Actually, the employees we were supporting took less time off sick than the rest of the workforce. That might have told us that we should be supporting the rest of the workforce, but that's another story. I guess one of the things that people really did tell us was how worthwhile it was. The first quote I've given you there is from someone who had addiction problems. It gives users an opportunity to get recognised as human beings. You can see some of the other quotes. I'll always have severe and enduring mental health problems, but they're no longer my life. I'm a mental health professional. This is what I am, this is what I do. I'm no longer a mental health condition. And time after time, we hear those kinds of comments. And I'd like to give you a little example of Emma. I first met Emma in 1997. She came for a job as a support worker in one of our rehabilitation hostels. She was wearing a yellow suit at the time. She had applied for 100 jobs, and no one had given her an interview until she came to my service. You see, while she'd been at university, she'd been studying psychology and she'd developed schizophrenia. She'd had to have just over a year off university, had managed to go back and finish her degree. She'd been told, she'd always wanted to be a clinical psychologist, but had been told by her therapist that she couldn't do that. It would be too stressful for her. So she applied to me for a job as a support worker, supported by our programme, and she got it. And she was absolutely delighted. It made me realise I can go into mental health as a form of work, she said. I'd thought the doors had been barred shut to me. Now I've studied psychology, I've been psychotic, and I work with psychiatric patients. So I'm able to see things from virtually all angles. And so she was. But the story didn't end there. And I think one of the key things we've got to remember, it's not just jobs, but careers. People need to be able to move on in jobs. After 3 years, she decided she wanted to be an employment specialist herself. So she got promoted and she started helping people to get jobs. And then she became a senior employment specialist, started managing other staff. She thought, maybe I'd like to do another degree. So she registered and did a master's degree part-time, got a distinction in it. And after 7 years, she said to me, do you think I could do clinical psychology, Rachel? And I said, why not? Go for it. Have a go and see. She applied. 2 years ago, she got her doctorate in clinical psychology, and I'm furious with her. Instead of coming to work in my service, she went to work at the Maudsley. So I'm sulking. Actually, she's on maternity leave at the moment. So her life changed hugely from being someone who thought it was all over, had applied for 100 jobs and never got one, to being really rather successful now. The trouble was with this programme that we persuaded people in South West London that people with mental health conditions could work, but only if you give them special help. The reality is that most of us work with the help of our nearest and dearest and the services that we use. We don't need special help from an employer. So we then got into having our charter for the employment of people with a mental health problem. This is where we started getting very grandiose. Have you guessed my diagnosis yet? What we said was, right, we want to employ people with mental health problems and addiction problems in our service. So what we said was, do you have person specifications for jobs? A list of things that the person applying has to be able to do. We said that personal experience of mental health problems was desirable, a desirable qualification for all the jobs in our organisation. We changed our advertisement to say, we welcome applications from people with mental health problems. And some of you will have heard me say yesterday, I have been working in the health services for too long. And I know that if you don't count it, you don't do it. We do have to monitor all sorts of things, and if you don't have to monitor it, it doesn't matter. So we monitored our recruitment, confidentially, on appointment, monitored our recruitment of people with mental health conditions. Every year since 1999, at least 15% of our recruits have had mental health conditions. 10 years after the Charter was introduced, 23% had a mental health condition. And what is more, the higher up you go, the more of them you find. At the bottom level jobs, it was only about 21%. That's the support staff. If you look at the qualified professionals, about 24%. If you look at the senior managers, the heads of profession, 31%. So I think in South West London, the lunatics are running the asylum. In fact, I know they are. The chief executive has been in an inpatient unit, and so has the director of nursing. I thought we had really succeeded when we recruited a consultant psychiatrist who 10 years previously had been compulsorily detained in our hospital. That was when I knew we had made it. But remember, having a charter isn't a substitute for providing support. If you just write things on a piece of paper, nobody ever does them. And I think it was really important to provide the support to make sure people got jobs. But then, of course, we rapidly came across those people who'd never worked. And I don't know about you, but we don't recruit people without references. Do you? I'm sure it's quite common. And there were loads of people who hadn't worked. They'd developed mental health problems in their teens. Well, to start off, I set up a volunteering project. Don't do that, it was a disaster. Well, no, it wasn't a disaster. We got loads of free labour. But nobody ever moved on into jobs. I think over the 2 years it was on, we had 100 volunteers and 2 people got jobs. That wasn't, 2% wasn't good enough for me. So we changed our mind. And what we did was we set up an intensive, time-limited work experience programme. This was actually funded by our Department of Work and Pensions. 10 weeks. And you did work experience alongside applying for jobs. So 3 days a week work experience and a day looking for jobs, doing your CV, applying for jobs, etc. So that was what we did. The other thing we found it did was allow sceptical staff in our services to see people working. A lot of people actually got jobs where they'd been doing their work experience because people liked them. 140 people started the programme, 81% of those completed it. There were more, if you compared the people doing the work experience programme to the people who we were just helping to get jobs, more likely to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia and more likely to have been out of work for longer. So it was serving a slightly different group of people. Half of them got jobs, 49% of them got jobs. The rest of them, most went into education or voluntary work after that. But half of those people got jobs. That was within 13 weeks. You know, we're not talking long-term stuff here. Now, what we found, though, was that work experience wasn't a substitute for paid employment. Various other organisations in England said, oh, we'll do that. So they just set up a work experience programme, and they insisted that anyone who wanted to work in their organisation did work experience. That didn't work. People dropped out. A lot of people don't need this. It's a very small group of people who do need this. So I think it's really important to remember this is an extra. But I guess when I was looking through the literature, I found that with this, I think we had reinvented a very old wheel. Back in the 1700s, at Bicêtre Hospital in France, the superintendent there, who's called Jean-Baptiste Poussin, instituted a policy of only employing staff from amongst convalescing and recovered inmates. And as Pinel, who was the medical superintendent there, said at the time, people who've got their own experience of being there actually were more sensitive. They were more able to deal sensitively with people and their problems. And they were the ones who were most likely to refrain from any kind of inhumane treatment. So we kind of forgot a lesson we learned in the great reforming of psychiatry, which we kind of recovered. So I guess from all of this, I'm going to shut up now. What have we learnt? Well, I suppose what I've learned is that people with mental health conditions and addiction problems, even more serious problems, even people who keep taking methadone or drug replacement thing, actually can get and keep jobs if you help them find the job that's right for them and you provide the right kind of support and you believe that they can do it. But I'd be lying if I said it's always been easy. There have been enormous barriers in the way. But I'm going to tell you about some of the barriers and the lessons that we've learned after the break. Have I bored you all to tears yet? I'm doing my research, you understand. Sorry, was that okay? Camera?
Thank you very much, Rachel. We now have some time for questions, if you have some. When I was listening to you, I was thinking about in my younger days, when I was living in my hometown. There was a man who was, he was a vagabond. I don't think his interest for work was very high. But when you mentioned client choice, I remember a story that the chief executive officer in the shipyard came over to him and he said, because it was a lack of people to work at that time, he said, well, can I offer you a job? And the man said, are you quitting? So, you have to listen to the client choice.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. Any questions? In the back there, all the way back. You get a microphone now.
It'll keep you fit.
Keep the hand up. There you see it.
I just wondered if you have any problems with stigma among the employers, if stigma is a problem.
Yes, it certainly is, and there has been some research within our Department of Work and Pensions that looked at whether employers said they would employ people with mental health problems, and about 60% said they wouldn't consider people. And I'm going to say but there. And I found that there were two things that we needed to do. First of all, we needed to be able to speak to individuals. I don't go to an employer and say, will you employ schizophrenia? Any more than I'd go and say, will you employ heart disease or diabetes? What I say is, will you employ Fred? And once the person has an identity, once they've got skills, abilities, that starts breaking down the label. I also find that, well, we all know just how prevalent mental health problems are in our communities. And you know, a lot of employers have either had mental health problems themselves or have experienced mental health problems in their families. So if we can know our local employers, if we can be there and if we can stop selling diagnoses, but actually selling individuals, I think we can break down a lot of that. But I have found the biggest anti-stigma device, well, two of them. The first one is a telephone number. That might sound very silly, but a lot of people, employers who I've worked with, managers who I've worked with, have said, okay, we'll take him on, but where do we go if we have problems? Who can I contact? People, if they've got support, if they've got someone they can contact for help if they don't know what to do, often are willing to do that. There was one young man, they don't always do it in the nice language though. One young man who I helped to get a job in a family removals firm, you know, house moving people's furniture. And the man who owned it said, yes, I'll take him on, he's a good lad. But if he goes peculiar, can I put him in the van and bring him up here? Well, we didn't give him a lecture about how to say things. We said yes. That young man, once, he was put in the van and brought up. Very good service I got too. That psychiatrist knows his stuff. That young man is now driving that van. And I just think that employer would never have taken him if we hadn't said, we're here to help. And it's someone I can contact, not in a year's time, but now. If I've got problems now, do I know what to do? So I think that's one of the lessons. Provide support. Don't provide lectures on attitudes, provide support. The second one is, once one person has got a job in a place, it's amazing how the next person finds it easier. All of our social psychology research suggests that the best way of breaking down that stigma is contact. Not just any old contact, not going and viewing the lunatics at Bedlam, but contact on equal times where people can actually get to know someone, see that they're doing okay, actually work collaboratively. So the more people we can help to get jobs, the more we are breaking down that stigma and that prejudice. So yes, it undoubtedly exists, but I think you can deal with it.
In front here.
There's a gym upstairs.
Thank you for a very inspiring lecture. When you engage people to the mental health services, I wonder if there are many of them who have relevant education in addition to experience.
I think that is hugely varied. Some people develop their problems after they'd got their education. Many, like Emma, developed it in the course of their education. That was why I said that in our early intervention service, helping people to carry on with their education in the normal way is something we would look at. Some people have qualifications, some don't. In England, 15% of psychiatrists will suffer from depression. I don't know, that's just because they've done the research. I don't know what the figures are for psychologists. I think we shouldn't assume that people are universally poorly educated. Sometimes people want to go back and study, but the more normal route for adults would be to go and work and either study part-time or do an apprenticeship or do your study while working. And our Department of Employment and Skills, no, it's called BIS now, actually recommends not that we do lots of training prior to work, but that for anyone who's unemployed, we look at training on the job and work relevant training. So if someone doesn't have the skills, we would normally help them to get a job and then to do some training as part of that, maybe go back. The other thing that we do find, and again, I don't know whether it's a problem here, but in inner city London, there are many people who have had a very bad experience of education, that they maybe have been excluded from school, done very badly at school, and aren't very interested in education, see it as a very bad thing. So for those people, getting a job first and then thinking about qualifications we found to be useful. So doing the two together rather than education then work, unless someone is of the age where they are at college, in which case that would be the ordinary bit to help them.